Welcome back to our third Ask the Meshperts, a short series of videos where we aim to address everything microservices, Kubernetes, and service mesh to answer some of the questions in the community or any questions that you share with us. If there are any topics you'd like us to cover, feel free to reach out at hello@aspenmesh.io and let us know. Today's topic is going to be focused on how a service mesh fits into your API strategy. But before we dive in, can I ask you all to give a quick introduction?
Sure. My name is Maddie, and I'm a software engineer here at Aspen Mesh.
I'm Laura. I'm also a software engineer at Aspen Mesh.
I'm Lori, and I'm not a software engineer at Aspen Mesh, and I'm very sad about that. The principal technical evangelist at F5 Networks.
A service mesh in your API strategy, why are we talking about it today? We're working with a lot of companies in the space right now that are doing microservices and have an API strategy. And one of the common questions we get from our early customers is, I already have tools that I'm using around my API mediation strategy. How does a service mesh fit in? It seems to also be a hot topic in the space right now. Gartner recently released a report on how a service mesh fits into your API strategy. One of the big things they said is by 2020, all leading container systems will include a service mesh technology. The idea there is that you're going to need probably something to mediate your north-south traffic and something to manage your east-west traffic. So we thought we'd spend a little bit more time on that today. So let's start with the basics. If we're just considering an API strategy at a high level, what are some of the considerations around why that's so important when you're adopting or using microservices?
I think the biggest issue is security. So as you break out into different microservices, you are introducing another level for exploitation at every point that you do that.
Mm-hmm.
And again, if, like you were saying, that they're predicting by 2020 that the majority of attacks against enterprises are going to be with insufficiently protected APIs, you need to have something like a Goldilocks level of just enough and not too much.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Right, that's a good point. The fact that when you do microservices, you start to gain a lot of attack area. So it's really good to have a strategy around how you're going to protect all that in the surface area. That's great. Lori, anything you'd add to that around why security is so important for microservices?
Well, I would add, because what enterprises often do when they deploy this technology is build an API that is sort of a unifying front on top of all of these microservices. So you have the APIs and the microservices talking to each other, and then you've also got this external API, and a lot of times it's used for integration, it's used for partners, it's used for mobile apps. So you've got two different sets of APIs basically to protect, and then you also have challenges with different formats, different data coming in that you may have to do transformations. You may have different types of authentication systems, and you have to somehow manage all of that and make it appear seamless, and also use it to protect, right, the API itself, and then also the microservices behind it, so they're not passing bad data from one microservice to another, because it may not be one microservice that's the target, but it might be one that's inside, and it's just getting passed through. So an API strategy can actually help to filter those kind of things out by stopping it at the edge, at the north-south, or in each of the microservices. It gives you better coverage and protection.
We've talked a little bit about ways companies have managed this in the past. Largely, it has been a north-south focus, exposing the APIs to external consumers. What are some of the preferred ways that companies have been doing that? What tools or technologies have they've been using in the past?
Now, of course, if you're a smaller organization or if you're a really ambitious organization, you could attempt to roll your own. But there is a lot that goes into that. And so I think a lot of companies choose instead to go with experts of API gateway builders or people who are building API gateways. So it's basically the kind of traditional API gateway. There are also companies that are doing kind of microservice-centered API gateways as well.
Right. What I think I've heard Gartner call the micro gateway. So your comms, your ambassadors that are focused around doing the same thing an API gateway does, but for microservices, kind of distributed endpoints instead of a centralized one.
Right.
Yeah, that's a good point. So what do you get with an API gateway? I mean, it helps manage north-south traffic, but Lori, maybe you can expand a little bit around some of the capabilities an API gateway gives you.
An API gateway, that's a loaded term.
Yeah. An enterprise gateway, a micro gateway.
Micro gateway, macro gateway, API.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, it really acts, at least today for most APIs, is like, it's a centralized, right, gate in and out. So it becomes a point at which you can manage security a lot better, right? Things like access control or scrubbing data. We as we're talking here, we're focusing on the threats coming in, and we're not thinking about protecting the users of those APIs, right? What if something got inside, and right, we want to be able to look at the data going out, make sure sensitive data isn't being released into the wild, things like that. An API gateway gives you kind of that point where you can do those kinds of functions and really protect incoming and outgoing. Mm-hmm. So it really becomes a really good strategic security point to apply those kind of policies.
All right. Yep, that's a great point. Okay, so an API gateway gives you a lot of abilities there. In terms of what a service mesh gives you, how do they compare? I mean, what's the difference between what an API gateway gives you? We know it does north-south, service mesh does east-west, but Lauren, maybe you can add a little bit more around some of the differences between the two.
So with an API gateway, you're getting that monitoring, you're getting some of that security, you're getting traffic management. It has some other things that a service mesh, and I think maybe somebody else will talk about that more, but APIs will also do things like handling billing or different kinds of monetization. And then they'll also do some other integration that service meshes aren't doing, whether it's Internet of Things or other kind.
Cool. Yep, so service mesh wise, what are some of the capabilities we get with a service mesh that you do not get with an API gateway? Maddie, maybe you can cover some of those?
Yeah, sure. So I think one of the main things is that a service mesh is going to handle your east to west traffic rather than your north-south traffic. So that's kind of one of its strengths, I would say, or the strength that it has over an API gateway. It has a bunch of capabilities within that. So in terms of like dynamically discovering services, automatic failure detection, authentication, authorization, load balancing. There's a lot of other things that a service mesh can do.
Right. I think a lot of the stuff that an API gateway doesn't think about because it's so focused on the API to external consumer traffic. And I also think it's something that are unique to containers and microservices, and it's not something a lot of organizations were thinking about until recently. Hence the reason a service mesh has come out as a new technology pattern in the last couple of years. I'm a believer that you're probably going to see these technologies merge together in one way or another, as we do with almost all technologies as they mature. But Laura, I wonder if you'd add your take and give a little bit on what you think the best way maybe to leverage the two together for the time being, as it seems like you probably still need them both for a little while.
Oh, you definitely need them both right away, because they aren't connected, and one really is focused on more on east-west and north-south, and there's not really a lot of glue today that makes them work together. I think that's what you're saying, is we'll see that kind of come together, but for right now, you really need the two to work together in order to provide all of the different capabilities around APIs externally and internally. So you need both right now.
Yeah, absolutely. And it'll be interesting to see. I think we've seen some interesting developments in the past 6 months or so with service mesh. You look at the fact that Istio used to use basic Kubernetes ingress. Use Kubernetes for ingress, and since 0.8 to 1, they updated it with the V1 Alpha 3 APIs, which provide much more fine-grained control around what you can do with ingress. So I see that as kind of a bit of service mesh that's eating away at some of the API gateway functionality. But I would also imagine there'll be things like billing that an API gateway does very well that a service mesh will probably not replace. I'm curious, what are the predictions? Do we see service mesh eating API gateway eating service mesh, or no, the two will continue to exist for the foreseeable future?
They'll both
It's like up for grabs.
Yeah.
put us on the spot. Write it down.
Yeah.
I think they're going to both continue to exist because there are still capabilities that an API gateway is going to provide, like quotas, rate limiting, right? Things around user, key authorization, maybe, even termination of things like TLS that aren't necessarily going to be done inside, where the service mesh is really going to take off and rule the roost, as it were. So I think they're both going to coexist, but they'll get better, integration and be able to do more in the future as people deploy it more and figure out what they can and can't do with each one.
Yeah. That makes a lot of sense to me. I would say I agree with that. Yep. Very cool. Well, thanks for the time today. We're trying to keep these short, so we'll end it there, but really appreciate everybody joining us for Ask the Meshperts today. Again, anybody watching, thanks for watching again. If you have any questions or if you would like to participate in the future Ask the Meshperts with us, feel free to drop us a line. We're at hello@aspenmesh.io. Thanks.